Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast by Bangalore International Centre.
Kabul is the thriving heart and the capital of Afghanistan, home to over 4 million people today, close to 15% of the entire population of Afghanistan. It is a city that has seen decades of conflict, and the one city actually hides many layers of history, some more visible than others. Welcome to BIC Talks. I'm your host, Pawan Srinath. Authors Taran N and Samhita Arni talk to each other about their experience living in Kabul and share some of their stories from this incredible city and throw some much-needed color to our somewhat monotone viewing of Afghanistan and Kabul. Samhita Arni is no stranger to BIC Talks and spent time living and working in Kabul in 2012-2013. Taran N is a journalist who spent time in Kabul between 2006 and 2013 and is the author of the award-winning new book, Shadow City, A Woman Walks Kabul. Hi Taran, thank you so much for joining us on BIC Talks. It's a pleasure to have you here joining us from Mumbai.
Thank you, Pawan. I'm really happy to be here.
And Sam, welcome back. It's great to have you back every time, both as a speaker, a discussant, and as a host. And over to you.
Thank you so much, Pawan. It's a pleasure to be back here at BIC Talks. First of all, Taran, huge congratulations. Not only have you written a beautiful, moving book, but you have received huge number of accolades for it. Taran's book recently got the Tata Lit Life First Book Award, and it has also been nominated for an international prize and shortlisted for that. Am I correct, Taran? That prize has some complicated name that I cannot remember.
Thank you, Sam. Yeah, it's the Edward Stanford Award for Best Travel Book of the Year, if I'm remembering it correctly. But yeah, it's wonderful to be part of this shortlist. It's a major international platform, and it's also great that there are other women writers on that shortlist. There are people from diverse backgrounds on that shortlist. So I feel really, really fortunate that Shadow City is part of these really interesting books.
Well, you deserve it. And I'd like to plunge straight away into this conversation and to ask you, Shadow City is based on your own experience of Kabul. What links does your family have to Afghanistan, and what possessed you to go there?
So I actually went to Kabul the first time in 2006, and I went there to work as a teacher. I went there to train Afghans working in a small radio and television station. And I enjoyed it so much. I went with my husband. We both loved the city, and we found really, really interesting friends. And we kept trying to find ways to go back. So we kept going back and forth for similar projects until 2013. So that's essentially the arc of the book, which is 2006, which was roughly about 5 years after the Taliban had been overthrown, to 2013, which was the year before the formal end of the Allied, presence or the combat operations in Afghanistan. So, which ISAF, as they're called, was due to formally end their combat operations in 2014. So that's sort of the arc of the book. And I feel I was really lucky to be there at that time. But I felt lucky to be going to Kabul in the first place, as you said, because I grew up in Aligarh, and my family is Pashtun heritage, my father's side of the family. And we always sort of the kids in that house, I didn't have much of a life in terms of going out or, much of excitement in terms of exteriors, but we always felt like a sense of our ancestors had come from this place called Afghanistan. And so when I got the chance to go, I had this sense of great curiosity and affinity and just joy, and my family was also sort of really excited, and they said, oh, it'll be really interesting and you'll get to see these amazing places. So I think that was an interesting entry point for me to get to Kabul, rather than going with a sense of fear or with a sense of going into a place which was marked by war. I was going in with this sense of curiosity and, enjoyment. So I think that was quite key in hindsight, of course. It seems to me now that it was quite key in how my relationship with the city developed. So over and over, I kept going back. I found ways to work with Afghan media professionals, and eventually I realized that there was a book in all those encounters.
I mean, I've been so excited about having this conversation with you because I myself spent some time in Kabul, and not as extensively as you had, just for a brief while in 2012 to 2013. But you've also had this view from 2006 to 2014 of this whole transition. How has Kabul changed in that time?
It changed tremendously, Sam. I think I'm curious to know how you saw it, but in 2006, the first time I visited, when I went for the first time, it was not so large as a physical city. The population had increased a lot from 2001, but by 2013, it had grown even larger. The physical limits of the city had extended way beyond what it had started. It was traditionally sort of the mountains ringing Kabul were the city limits, but by 2013, it had gone far beyond that. A lot of the old houses were being torn down, multi-story apartments were coming up. There were so many malls and these multi-story structures that came up during this time. Physically, the city changed a great deal while I watched. And also during this time, because the security situation was steadily deteriorating, there was also a sense of withdrawal from the international community and even from the Afghan government. So you started to see these big concrete barriers come up. You saw sandbags and barriers that started appearing on places that I could sort of earlier walk through quite easily, suddenly vanished behind these big concrete walls, blast walls. So it was a sense of the city transforming in very, very deep and fundamental ways. At the same time, it was also, I think, interesting to see how people were finding roots. They were setting down roots. They were settling down. They were finding a measure of prosperity. So I had colleagues who were really happy that they were able to build a house in Kabul. After years of living as refugees in different countries, they were finally able to settle down. They were able to raise their families in their own homes. You had that range of experience, I think, over this time.
It's really interesting for me to hear you say that, because when I went in 2012, those sandbags, those concrete structures, all of those sorts of things were very much in evidence. And that was the Kabul that I knew, like everything hidden behind these huge high walls with watchtowers and guards peering over from these watchtowers when I lived in Wazir Akbar Khan. But that wasn't always the case in your experience. So that's also really interesting how much a city shifts and changes over a decade.
Absolutely. And I think I was thinking just before our conversation that I haven't been back since 2013. And I think it seems to me from a distance, of course, I'm not qualified to really answer what is it like in Kabul now. But I think at least from a distance, from I read, from what I hear from friends, it seems like another cycle of transformation has gone through. And it would be maybe even from the time you were there, it would perhaps be even more of a fortressed city, more of a feeling of being constantly behind some kind of protective barrier when you were out. So 2006, like you said, I was lucky to see that whole transition. And I think that was also the time which moved in an emotional sense from a feeling of hopefulness, from a feeling of renewal, to a realistic sort of appraisal of how much had not worked out with the international intervention in this country.
Yes, and that's a huge long topic. But before we go there, I really want to ask you about, a woman walks in Kabul, and this is such a unique thing. You talk about this experience of walking, you relate it to your own childhood experience as well. Did you ever feel unsafe in Kabul? You talk about walking even in your childhood as being a kind of a pleasure, a luxury. So can you speak a little bit about that?
It's interesting because the idea of walking was already something I had a complicated relationship with when I went to Kabul. When I got to Kabul, one of the very first things I was told was that I shouldn't walk. And this wasn't because I was a woman. This was because I had come from abroad to work. Of course, there were people on the roads. Of course, there was a life of the streets. But hearing this landed differently for me, I think, because as a woman who grew up in North India, I already had this history of being told not to do certain things. And I think for me, that was really very often how journeys began, was being told not to do certain things and then trying to find ways to do them anyway. And it felt like a moment of familiarity in this very new city that I just appeared in. Strangely, that I think was the beginning of this journey into Kabul for me as well. And I think for most women in India, a lot of women I've spoken to, they really connect with this thought. To be able to walk through your own city, even if it's a city you've grown up in, even if it's a city you're very familiar with, you had to have a reason. You couldn't just be out for no reason at all. The idea of strolling around for leisure, this was very male domain, So for a woman to just be loitering around, that just really didn't work. So you had to, even in the way you moved, the way your posture was, the way you carried yourself through the streets, you had to demonstrate a reason, a purpose, the right to be on the streets. And this was something that I had, negotiated through my life until the moment I got to Kabul. So all this was playing into the experience of walking or not walking in this new city. And I'll read a bit from the book just to get into this topic, and then we can talk more. One of the first things I was told when I arrived in Kabul was never to walk. It was early 2006, 5 years after the overthrow of the Taliban government by US-led coalition forces, around the same amount of time that the Taliban had been in power before 2001. Winter was just beginning to fade, and like the seasons, Kabul was on the verge of turning, though we did not know it then. As spring transformed the surroundings, I joined the rush of bodies on the street and took my first walk in the city. My memory begins from a place I almost certainly did not start from. I must have got there somehow, but in my mind, I first recall moving through a bazaar called Mandai on the southern side of the Kabul River. I remember making my way through narrow lanes and shops that extended onto the street. Traders and their carts spilling onto the thoroughfares, stepping around the piles of dried fruit, tins of cooking oil, soap. The way the dull sunlight of that rainy spring day filtered through the canopies erected over some shops. The earth was muddy, the market not too crowded. Familiar, like the bazaars of cities I knew in India. I recall walking onto a bridge and buying a checked scarf from a young man standing by its railing. His face was barely visible behind his stock of fluttering fabrics, which he had tied to a wooden frame resting on his shoulders. He smiled when I took his picture. Behind him were the mountains that encircled Kabul, the Koh-e-Sher Darwaza on my left, the Koh-e-Asmai to my right. Between them, below the bridge, was the river, sluggish with some water, some rubbish. I moved across the bridge, and in the process, I spanned the city's history, from the Sheher-e-Kohna, or the old city, to the Shahr-e-Nau, or the new suburbs, ahead of me. Memory returns in fragments. I remember walking through the half-empty streets, feeling the sun on my back. I heard snatches of song on a radio, past a group of young men lounging on a broken sofa they had pulled onto the street. I saw walls with bullet marks, barriers across gates, and the glass panes of shop fronts painted with calligraphy. Under my feet was the slush of the spring. There was smoke rising from the chimneys and evening coloring the snow on the peaks of the Paghman range on the horizon. Birds on the bare branches of trees, singing songs of the approaching dusk. Back in my room, I had tried to brush the mud off my shoes, my clothes, but it had clung stubbornly. I had looked out of the window. Beyond the walls that enclosed the courtyard, the city had changed. It shimmered like a promise, far larger than I had thought. The more I walked, the larger it revealed itself to be.
Lovely. What I love as well about your writing is you're using also the metaphor of wandering through the city and the literature of the city as also this idea of walking and discovering all of that. So your poetry and language guide you through Kabul. Yet you seem to get that from your grandfather. And so your grandfather sort of appears as this guide who's taking you through this city. Can you talk a little bit about him and your relationship with him and how he mediates your experience of Kabul?
Yes, a pleasure. My maternal grandfather, who I call Baba, he was really key in how I saw Kabul. And like you said, this was one way of course, experiencing the city was to set foot on the streets and walk through and to experience it with intimacy, which was wonderful. And I think it just yields a different relationship with the city. Of course, it does. That's just common sense, I think. But what Baba gave me, in a sense, was the discernment to see how deep these paths could be and how he, in fact, had never been to Kabul, but he knew it really well. And he told me this. He said, some cities I've never been to, but I know really well. This was because of books and through reading and through his immersion in the sort of the shared common culture across the region, which he was extremely familiar with. He was, sort of immersed in. And for that reason, he had a fluency in Kabul that even while I was there, I didn't really have. And I think this was such a gift for me because I would come back from Kabul, I would tell him certain things, and he would tell me things about those sites that I had seen. And then I would say, oh, okay, I didn't know that. And I'll go back and look in Kabul, and I would find that the city would just shift because of what my grandfather had told me about it. And then people there would say, yes, and then there's also this other thing. And so it was like he just built this bridge from his study in Aligarh, which is where he lived, to Kabul without really leaving that room. And it was having this kind of knowledge, having this kind of immersion into a city, especially a city like Kabul, where so much of its history has been erased by the last 40 years of war. This was a really magnificent gift, I think, for me, because I'll give you an example. He told me about the Shahnameh, which is a really beautiful epic, which is familiar to most Persian speakers around the world. And one of the characters in the Shahnameh is Rudaba, who was a princess of Kabul. And she falls in love with Zal, who is a warrior, and they have this wonderful romance. And they eventually, despite opposition, they end up marrying. And Baba told me this story one evening sitting in Aligarh. And knowing this changed the way I approached Kabul, because I saw it as a setting for romance. I saw it as a place of love and longing and the fulfillment of love. And also I saw it as a part of the literary history of this entire region. And for most people, I think Kabul isn't a place you think of in terms of poetry or love or literature. But seeing it like this shifted the way I was or I saw the city. And it altered the things I was looking for as well, I think. I was able to go beyond the really evident stuff and delve into these different layers thanks to my grandfather.
I love that response for so many reasons, because it also brings, you mentioned the word bridge, and that kind of is also the origin of Kabul, right? Could you explain that?
One of the stories about Kabul's name is that it was a magic island in the middle of a river. It was built by a king, and to get to this magic island, he built a bridge, which is a pull made of ka, which is hay. So the combination of these two words, ka and pull, is what give the city its name, which is Kabul. And yeah, as you said, it's a really beautiful metaphor because, it's this path that leads you into this magic island, but you can only see it if you want to see it.
And the metaphor is also your relationship with your grandfather being part of that bridge, you also being that bridge in some ways for your grandfather and his heritage. So that's profound on so many levels.
Yeah, many bridges.
Yeah. You also mentioned love and longing, and I was struck by that. What popped up in my head was this description from the Babur Nama that you quote of Babur's life in Kabul, which it was quite wild.
It was very wild, yes. And that's, I think, the candidness of this book is just really remarkable. I mean, reader after reader has said that's remarkably candid. And even then, it just really impresses you with how he just didn't hold back, this guy in his 20s writing about everything. Again, my grandfather he gave me a copy of the Babarnama before one of my trips there. And I could sort of discover Kabul while having this medieval text with me. Around that time, the Bagh-e-Babar, which is the Babar Gardens where his grave is located, were also being renovated. So I could sort of wander through that space as well while reading what he had written about Kabul. And what still strikes you, I think, for any reader who reads this text, is his affection for the city and also his sense of great curiosity for everything. Like, he counted the number of tulips, he lists all the birds you see, he's, really interested in the whole sort of climatic changes within the region. So he's a really interesting companion to have while you're discovering a new city, I think. He had quoted this poem, which I can read out in the Babarnama. But in one of the parts of the Babarnama, he described epic drinking sprees during his years in Kabul and in anguished detail listed the after effects of an excess of alcohol and majun, which is a mix of opium and other substances. So he writes, a majun party never goes well with an arak or wine party. The drinkers began to talk wildly and chatter, mostly alluding to majun. Try though I did to keep the situation under control, nothing went well. There was much repulsive bedlam, the party became intolerable, and I disbanded it. In the midst of Kabul's expat life, the Babarnama read as an accomplished memoir of life in a war zone, with drugs, booze, and desperate love affairs.
When I read that bit, I was just like, wow, I was there in 2012 and nothing had changed. There was a lot of parties, there was a lot of alcohol and love affairs as well that was happening in the Kabul of 2012. And I was also struck because in that time, and I don't know if this was also true of in 2006, every expat's life in Kabul revolved around getting alcohol and going on trips to get alcohol and then trying to sneak it past customs because it's not allowed in. So everyone had all of these wild ways of, sneaking vodka in Sprite bottles and things like that.
I'd heard about this, but this wasn't my experience at all in Kabul. I think basically because I was really fortunate in being able to work with mostly with Afghans, with Kabulis, and I didn't really have to live in compounds, which I think was wonderful for me. So, of course, I knew and I had some experience of this world of expats and parties and all the adventures that went on. But I didn't really experience it in any great detail to be able to talk about it or write about it. But I think there have been other works that deal with this.
But you came there in 2006, which you described as a gold rush. Could you break that down a little bit for us? Why would you call it a gold rush?
Yeah, I think this was something I wasn't prepared for or I hadn't anticipated in any way. But around 2006, there was a lot of foreign funding and a lot of foreign aid available in Afghanistan. And of course, that came with its own problems and that had its own strings attached. And there are all kinds of critiques as to how that was actually not serving the country as much as contractors and so on. But the fact is that around that time, there seemed to be a lot of just what I felt was a lot of pitching going on for projects. And, there were many, many businesses starting or many companies that were trying to, do many, many things. In the field of media, I know that was a time of great boom. And I think that was what I was trying to talk about when I said it felt like a gold rush, was because there was this constant hum of energy and a constant hum of the sense that there was a lot of money to be made. And also that it was a limited time to make this money because it would only last as long as the international agencies and the international powers were there.
Speaking of the money to be made and that gold rush, and I think the listeners to this will find this very entertaining. Can you tell us a little bit about Narco Palaces?
Narco Palaces, or I think they were also called Opium Palaces or Mashallah Mansions. There are all these different names for these constructions. But essentially, if you walk down or you drove down this locality called Sherpur, it wasn't only there, but they were very, very prominent there. And this locality had completely changed after 2001. And it had sort of been parceled out to various members of the elite. And on these strips of land had come up these very, very opulent buildings, which I think they were written about a lot as well at one point. They had these, many dozens of bedrooms and underground car parking. And they were in these pastiche of colors, just all the candy colors you can imagine. And they were obviously called Narco Palaces because of the links to the whole economy of opium. And they were often rented by NGOs or by, large agencies because they had all these facilities available for their staff. So it was one of the great contradictions of this time in Kabul, I think, to be, going through the street, which was very poorly paved, even barely any street lighting, but you had these really magnificent mansions all around you. And they were clearly, an aberration in the architectural style of the city as well, because they were built of marble and they tended to get extremely cold in the winter. And they also had balconies, which are quite pointless for Afghan families because very few Afghan families would be sitting in full view of the street. So they were clearly this sort of symbol, I think, of the overheated economy and how that was displaying itself in these strange, sort of manifestations of impunity and also just luxury.
I remember driving down Sherpur Street at one point and seeing a sign saying for rent, 27 bedrooms, and it was bizarre. It was unbelievable.
There were so many ads that you saw in the magazines that were aimed at expats, which had similar kind of specifications. So and so number of underground parking available. How many cars would you need? But it was all there. And like you said, the for rent both started coming up closer and closer to 2014.
Another sense that I get, and when I'm reading your book, and you called, Kabul an amnesiac city because of all of the disappearing past, and literally there are just traces of it. But there are so many layers of Kabul. Could you talk about those various layers? Just pulling it out from what I recollect of reading your book, there's, the Babur's Kabul, there's the Soviet invasion in certain places. You can see the remnants of that. There are memories of Taliban-occupied Kabul. Can you talk about these layers and what they look like and what they feel like?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about Kabul is that when someone like me arrives there, I was thinking in terms of before the Taliban and after the Taliban. That was really it. It sounds ridiculous to say it now, but honestly, that was really I wouldn't say my entire frame of reference, but that was definitely my main frame of reference at that point. And soon realized that this was obviously an inadequate one for the city that had seen many, many decades of war, and of course, much deeper history before that. And I think the term amnesiac city, which I read in another history of Kabul, was interesting because it, as you say, it indicates that there are many layers of the city that have either been obscured by war or by different forms of forgetting. The one thing I really took away from my time in Kabul is that narratives are almost always more complicated than they appear. So from the simplest thing, like, for instance, once I was passing by this structure, the broken down structure of a cinema hall, and I just assumed that it had been destroyed by the Taliban. But the friend I was with said, no, this was destroyed during the Civil War. And, that for me was, an adjustment, because I had to sort of think of the period before the Taliban as had actually destroyed a lot of Kabul at that time, and a lot of its physical infrastructure had been destroyed during the years between 1992 to 96, which predated the Taliban. So it was small shifts like this, and then also, of course, larger shifts in terms of the story I heard in the Afghan Film Archive, which really complicated the narrative of how that archive was saved. And, because what I had read and what I had heard was that it was the members of the employees of that organization, which is where Afghanistan's film heritage had been stored. They heard that the Taliban was coming to destroy it, and they saved it, which is true. But there is also the element that they were told that this would happen by someone from within the Taliban administration. And this was, a completely different layer to the story. And so the story remains the same, but it also transforms, And the narrative then of saving Afghans, I think, becomes more complicated, because at a certain times, all you heard was stories of Afghans being saved. And I think it's a lot more complicated than that, I mean, it was an easy narrative and maybe what the world wanted to hear at that time. But if you probe the surface of these stories, it's almost always a more layered, a more textured, and a more, complicated story that emerges. So I think this was my biggest learning from just looking at Kabul in this way of a city that, reveals story after story, layer after layer. The longer you spend, the more people you speak to.
What also struck me was when I went there in 2012, and I had this very black and white idea, Taliban bad, everybody else good. And then you go there and you actually talk to actual Afghans, and then you will discover, oh yeah, I was doing that. I was a newsreader on radio for the Taliban. And there are so many of those stories. And that really makes you rethink that at that time, there was no other jobs in Kabul but to work for the Taliban. But all of these same people were having so much difficulty in going abroad or getting certain papers because of their association with the Taliban in that time. And that, again, like what you were saying, that area of gray really comes through when you hear those stories. This makes me think also of this story that you have in your book about you're living in this house with this man called Khalid, and he has two friends who come and visit. And one is an army commander and the other is a Mujahideen guy. And they have this shared history of being... I mean, can you tell us a little bit about that?
I don't want to give away a lot of the book, but essentially the story is of two men who are formerly on opposite sides of the conflict. So much so that one of them is in charge of assassinating the other, and he fails, obviously. And years later, here they are sitting in a garden, sharing a drink together, and they're watching the NATO choppers in the evening making their way back. And this was obviously a really freaky image, but also I think a really revealing image about how to think about war and how to think about time in Kabul. And what I was really struck by was how things keep shifting, and really what people have learned to figure out or to work with is how does it affect them? And it wasn't unusual, I think, the situation, because the way history has been in the city and in this entire region, everything has changed. So, I think it was just, to me, it was a moment that really marked how difficult it was to think about things like ideology, about taking sides in a battle, or to even think about conflict as something that was very fixed. I found Anand Gopal's book, No Good Men Among the Living, to be a really magnificent excavation of this idea, because what he shows through he traces three characters through the book, and he traces an ally, and what he calls an ally, an enemy, and a civilian. And you see very quickly how all these boundaries are overlapping, all the categories are falling apart. It's just nothing is really making sense in terms of ideological lines or in terms of who's fighting for what, and people are doing what they have to do to survive. Essentially, that's the idea behind the book. And I think that really, I completely felt that resonated with me while I was in Kabul.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the same thing for me. I mean, my view of people kind of shifted after I experienced Kabul and that flow of history.
Yeah, it does. It does do that. Being in that city for any time, I think, has this effect of making you reevaluate how history is written, how you approach conflict, or even the idea of peace. I think it completely, for me, it really affected the way I see what is it that we see as empowerment and what is it that we see as being voiceless. As a journalist, I think it was very interesting for me to think of where do we see conflict? Because if you're talking about war reportage, say, or talking about conflict reportage, in modern warfare, where is the front line? This is a question I don't think we can really truly get the answer to. Is it in the control room where the drones are being controlled? Is it, with the soldiers, or is it with the soldiers when they go back with all kinds of PTSD? And they're back. I mean, there's this book by Anne Jones called They Were Soldiers, which traces how the effects of war have influenced the lives of American soldiers who returned from Afghanistan. I think it's just Afghanistan, or maybe Afghanistan and Iraq. But so is it in that violence that the soldier is then manifesting back in his own country? Is it in Kabul, because there's been such a boom in opium production? Is it in the lives of young children who are now addicted to opium because of this entire conflict? Where is this conflict and where does it end? And the marks that this kind of war has left in the everyday lives of ordinary people. I think the idea of conflict reporting or war reportage, it does need to become slightly bigger to be able to accommodate these kinds of thoughts.
Yeah, that's very profound as an insight as well. Where is that front line? Because you see it sometimes with the women in Kabul, and you see it in homes rather than actually on the street. So it can shift. There's an interesting part in your book where you talk about being a woman who's living in a house full of men. And there's a particular kind of male subculture that you experience.
Yeah, that was fun. I wasn't deprived of female company in my life because there were so many women who were around all the time. I had close women friends, I had colleagues. But it so happened that in that home, for most of the time, I was the only woman around. And it was also just sort of being around Afghan men of a certain age, because they were all the older generation of men, and watching them watch the city change. I think that was really interesting for me. And there was, of course, this whole sort of idea of, propping up the Kalashnikovs on the sofa and just saying, oh, be careful, there's a box of grenades under that couch and so on, which made me jump a few times. But there was also the sense of, I think I was lucky in the sense that I could, because we spent so many evenings at home, I could just listen to them talk. And one of our housemates, Dr. Saab, would tell the most delightful stories about the city of his childhood and his youth. And he left Kabul when he was around 18. And he was like a Sherazad, just sort of holding forth about the city, which was always beautiful. And it was just always this perfect place. And he would just take us on all these expeditions to sweet shops, to the best ice cream store, to the cinemas, to the parks, and he kept talking about a bunch of photographs that he'd taken before he left Kabul for Germany when he was a teenager. And he never showed them to me, but he always said he would. So those photographs also became part of this mythology of the city. So I think I saw like a varied range of feelings in that home. It was also the idea of people being separated from their families, of being caught in the ebb and flow of family life from a distance, and also the sort of sense of fun and freedom that they got because, they didn't have those daily responsibilities in the city and they could just, be boys again. So it was quite an interesting, subculture to inhabit within that larger canvas of the city.
I really related to it because I was living in a guest house in Wazir Akbar Khan that was run by these group of mix of Hazara, Tajik, Pashtun men, and I'd come back from work and they'd all be sitting on the couch and they'd all be watching, of all things, Chota Bheem, and I sat there and watched Chota Bheem with them. That is the only point in my life I have ever watched Chota Bheem, and to the extent that when I came back to India, and they used to call me Chutki, who's a female character in Chota Bheem, and then I came back to India and I named my cat Chutki in their honor.
In the honor of the Afghan months with.
But it just also brought to me the kind of link again between India and Afghanistan and the kind of the popular cultural narratives that we've created here through Bollywood, through television. Afghans are so into that. They see a huge shared collection. I remember so many people saying all the Khans in Bollywood are actually, Afghans.
Yeah. I think they're super into it, as you said, like way more than, I was at that point. In fact, one of my earliest trips, I think we went on a picnic to Paghman, and a really large farm, and there were horses, and one of the horses had this very odd fringe. And I asked these two young teenage boys who were standing with him, I said, what's with the haircut? And they were like, oh, his hair is cut like Tere Naam, Salman Khan and Tere Naam. So they'd actually given him that same pudding bowl haircut to the horse, which, which Salman Khan had in Tere Naam. So I was really blown away by that. I was like, okay, I knew that, Kabulis love Bollywood, but I didn't realize I'd find horses style like film stars here. So it's really, in a way, it's really charming. It's really warm, and it's really endearing how much they have this affection for Bollywood. And there's a sense of intimacy. Like I was always being told about how, older men or older women were so enamored of the older movie stars like Madhubala and Dilip Kumar, and they sort of owned them, like you said. And for the younger, like the slightly younger people, they had these fantastic memories of Dharmatma being shot in Bamiyan, and someone said that they'd run away from school to Bamiyan to watch the shooting, and they were in love with Hema Malini, and Feroz Khan was so dashing, and all of that. So it's extremely potent, and it's not just recent; it's quite old. But that's not the only thing. It's easy to get caught up in just the Bollywood part of it, but the shared cultural connection is so much wider. And this was something I kept hearing more from Afghans. I think for Indians, it's become something vague or something slightly remembered, if at all. For Afghans, very often they would tell me with a sense of urgency, we have a very shared culture. We have a lot in common. And it felt like they were telling me something really important, something that it was important that I understand. And I think that was because they sensed that the feeling was stronger from their side than it was from the Indian side. And this was, of course, through music. If you look at music in Kharabat, which is a street in Kabul, so much of it is linked to Indian classical music. Poetry, there were so many people who told me how much they love Ghalib and Bedil, all the classic poets. There was a sense of connection, I think, which my grandfather felt. But I really had to go there to figure out.
So we've talked about the men of Kabul. I want to also talk about the women of Kabul. And you have some particularly feisty characters in your book. Could you talk a little bit about them? And I'm also curious about this episode where you go and retrace the grave of a young woman who died in Kabul and what that meant for you.
Yeah, so I met so many interesting women. It seems almost banal to even say it, but they all had the most incredible stories to tell me, and they were all extremely generous and graceful with how they dealt with all the things they'd been through. And there was this sort of matter-of-factness about just the idea of getting on with their lives. And I think that was really inspiring for me, because just hearing their stories, hearing the kind of things that they often had to clash with or collide with, and they still did it with this sense of humor, which is really wonderful. Like my friend Nazira, who's a journalist and a media professional, and she was very offended when I said that is there a library in Kabul? I asked her one day, and she was so offended that she arranged a visit to the library for me, just to show that, of course, there's a library here. Where do you think you are? And she had this incredible spunk, and she was very ambitious about her work. And she had the most delightful stories about the city and her life there. So she was a thoroughly modern, young Kabuli woman. And there were all these older women who I worked with who had been a part of the professional workforce of Kabul before the Taliban. Some of them had lived through the Taliban era as well. And then they were, of course, like the women who had left the country and who had been refugees, and then they'd come back to the city, and they were trying to figure out a way to make it home again and to raise their families here. So it was just every single woman had a really, really incredible story to tell. And I think looking for Naheed's grave, which is what you were referring to, was important for me, because I realized how, again, it came with the idea of the amnesiac city, and how when you look for markers of loss, you're often looking for the really obvious ones. But in Kabul, this sense of loss itself was so complicated that you could see a monument or a marker in the most everyday of sights. So in this case, it was just an apartment block in a neighborhood called Micro Rayan. And this young woman called Naheed, the story, there were many versions of the story, but the version that I'd heard was that she was a teenager who was essentially chased to her death by a group of fighters who controlled that locality during the Civil War. And she lived on the 6th floor of this apartment building, and she jumped from her apartment window to save herself from being raped. And she was called a martyr, and her grave was located very close to where she used to live. And I went and I tried to find it. And while I was looking for it, I found a range of responses which were very revealing in themselves, because people, some of them were helpful, some people were sort of wondering why I was interested in her life. And eventually I found her grave, which was a very simple sort of structure right behind the place where she used to live. And the apartment that her family occupied was empty, but the other apartments in that building had families living in them. And all around that place was the hustle and bustle of life. So for me, it was really felt like a moment when I saw how, where you least expect to see it, there is a monument to some kind of loss in the city. And I think Naheed's story was just another way of seeing how complicated these narratives of violence against women are, because I had only heard about the Taliban's violence against women, and of course that's all true. I had to go to Kabul to learn how brutal the years of civil war were for women there, and it was extremely common. Rape was common. Of course, it was a brutal time for everyone, but these stories of violence against women were more, they were definitely more frequent during 1992 to 96 than I had heard of before I went to Kabul. So Naheed, again, was another illustration for me of how complicated narratives can be in Kabul once you start, poking at the surface. There was another very, very moving and inspiring woman I met in a clinic for drug de-addiction. And she had been addicted to opium for several years. Her husband was a laborer, and he had become addicted in Iran, where he had gone to work. And very often, this was a story I heard quite frequently, was that to stop her from complaining about his addiction, he told her to start taking the drug as well. And she was trying to break away from this habit because she was pregnant and she wanted her new child. She already had other children who were already addicted to opium. And she said, I want this new child to have a chance to grow up without this, this poison in him. So she was there to make an effort. And it was so clear that the chances, like the odds were stacked against her in this really, really difficult way. But she was there trying to make this change in her life. And I found that so inspiring and so really tragic because, again, it really makes you feel like these are the tracks that 4 decades of war have left in the everyday lives of women and children. And surely they should be counted as such.
So Taran, somebody once told me that Afghanistan leaves a kind of a nasha and that it gets under your skin. Do you feel that way?
I mean, it definitely got under my skin enough for me to write a book about it, yeah. And it was a very special time, Sam, when I was there. There was a sense of energy. Like I said, when we arrived there was a lot going on. There were all these young and old filmmakers, creative people who had either come back to Kabul from, Iran, or they had stayed there through the Taliban years and they were ready to try this new thing. And they were just discovering the city through their work. And I found it really interesting to be around them because they had this sense of, let's just tell stories with whatever we have, whatever we can do, let's just do that. And they had day jobs, they had a lot of problems, but they went ahead and they did it anyway. They had this intense commitment to the idea of filmmaking or telling stories. So I think that was what really stuck with me. And I enjoyed that so much. And I learned so much. It's very ironic that I went there to teach and I ended up learning so much from these people who I was lucky enough to be around. That kept me going back as often as I could.
Thank you for that. And thank you so much for this, this amazing conversation. I've really enjoyed it. And I'd like you to actually end with something from your book, if that's all right.
On the streets of Kabul, poetry shines forth from a range of surfaces. The rears of Corolla taxis and the backs of trucks are eloquent with verses, from modern ditties to the words of long-dead poets. Walls record pithy comments like the phrase scribbled opposite a military compound, "Stop singing songs of broken love." And poetry recurs in conversations with Kabulis who love to pepper references with a few choice verses. In this city, the words "Shair Mega" or "the poet says" are often argument clinchers. Poetry illuminates the everyday with its luster and its colors memories. Rings out in the voices of street children who burn spun or small seeds in their tin boxes as a charm against the evil eye, in return for a few Afghani notes. They twirl the fragrant smoke over cars and people, reciting the verses that seal them from harm. Spand wala band, spand nazar band, ba ishq shaye naqsh band, ba dukhtaraye samarkand. Spand lock away the demons, Spand turn away the evil eye, for the love of the king of Naqshband and for the beauty of the girls of Samarkand. Embedded in these few lines, recited at breakneck speed by ragged children, is a link to Kabul's own deep past and its place in the shared history of the region.
That was lovely, and it's been such a pleasure to have this conversation with you and go back into Kabul, even if not physically, through this book and through your words and through your descriptions. It's a really, really beautiful book, and it deserves all the accolades you've gotten and much more.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you for talking to me about the city that we share. It's really meaningful to be able to swap reminiscences with someone.
And thank you both for joining us. Thank you for listening in till the end. Please share this episode with a friend on social media, WhatsApp, or anywhere else. It would mean the world to us. And in case you're listening via iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. Subscribe to BIC Talks on email or your favorite podcast app and don't miss out on future episodes. This episode of BIC Talks has Gaurav Krishna as our sound engineer with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Lekha Naidu. And the accompanying episode artwork was made by Chandni Venkataraman.
Thank you for listening to this episode of BIC Talks. This podcast can be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org, as well as on any of your favorite podcast platforms. Tune in for new episodes every week. And do subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages to stay informed on our latest updates.